Well, hey everybody, this is Mr. G. We're going to be talking about the Cold War and the history of rock and roll today. And like we've been talking about, art and the like is not created in the bubble, and these things were influencing rock and roll when rock and roll was created in the 1950s. So, as society and the teenager, the civil rights movement, and the Cold War are one of those things that influenced the birth of rock and roll. So we have to back up a little bit and talk in our conversation about the 1950s and go back to the 1940s and World War II. This is the Empire of Japan, although it was short-lived, maybe like 5 years or so. This is how far they took in the Pacific. And during World War II, we had to island hop and take back those islands or drive the Japanese out of those islands. And they were tenacious fighters. They wouldn't surrender easily. Some opted to commit suicide rather than to surrender to the Americans if they were captured, or also booby trap themselves and take their lives and the lives of other people around them, so they wouldn't have to surrender to the enemy. Collage of pictures kind of indicates that. If you look at the top left picture there, you can see a kamikaze pilot, which was pretty much a suicide mission, a Japanese fighter plane just banking into the starboard side of that ship there. And as we got closer to Japan, the Japanese became more and more desperate to try to keep the Americans away. The war had been going on for 5 years. The war was won in Europe, and so they found it necessary to drop an atomic bomb on Japan to end this war. And it was flown by that guy right there in the middle. His name is Paul Tibbets. Ironically, or interesting enough, he was from Columbus, Ohio area, Reynoldsburg to be exact. He flew this plane called the Enola Gay, and he dropped one bomb on Hiroshima, and then the second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. And these are the victims of the people who were hit by the bomb. So this caused America to realize the power and potential of the atomic era. So the power and potential of these atomic weapons, and looking at pictures of those victims of the atomic blast, it caused us to pause and realize how scary those weapons can be. And so we were the only one to have the bomb until the end of the 40s when the Soviet Union acquired the bomb. And now we start the arms race in the Cold War. And that's the context of which rock and roll will be born and grow. So let's do this really fast. Find your notes for the 1950s and fill these things in. These are the important topics to get in there. Or if you just want to transfer the picture over, I will check these for points. Anyway, who were the presidents during this time? Truman and Eisenhower. Truman actually gave the order to drop the atomic bomb on Japan. He was the president at the end of the 40s and into the beginning of the 50s. And he had also had this doctrine called the Truman Doctrine that he was committed to stop the spread of communism where it would occur around the globe. The second president in the 1950s was a Republican by the name of Dwight D. Eisenhower. He got his notoriety because he was the Allied leader general during World War II with all the Allied forces, and he had a kind of a more softer approach with the Soviet Union. Not that he tolerated communism, but he didn't want to necessarily antagonize them, so he tried to kind of live amicably with them, whilst at the same time trying to work against the Soviet and stealthily. So the main idea of this slide is just to talk about how the world reshaped itself after World War II, and it pretty much was split between the forces of the Democratic slash United States side, which would be wrapped up in an organization called NATO, all right, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and they were supposed to try to hold the Soviets at bay. The opposite side of that was this Warsaw Pact, which was led by the Soviet Union, and they were the communist entity. And it's through these two entities that we tried to prevent a third world war between these two mega powers and allies. So, and as weird as it's going to sound, the atomic weapons, because they would be MAD, M-A-D, mutual assured destruction, this is what they used so they wouldn't have these wars. So the wars had to be fought kind of what they say clandestinely or secretly between the two superpowers and fought amongst smaller groups. And this even spilled out into Asia. Eventually, China would become a communist entity. We were hoping it would go democratic side. It did not. Other countries within Asia were starting to experiment with this idea. Vietnam, Korea got split between those two. Vietnam was actually split originally between North and South. And the north sides of both Korea and Vietnam were the communist sides, and the southern part were supposed to be the more democratic side, the ones that we wanted to see win. The Philippines went our way, and so did Japan. Even though we were fighting them during World War II, they became an ally of us after the war. So back home inside the United States, we were committed to try to stop the spread of communism. As I already mentioned, the Truman Doctrine, created by President Truman, he said, where forces of communism pop up, we will try to help stop that. And so that's why it eventually led to a war in Korea, which we'll get into here in a second. But inside the United States, we were worried about communists actually rising up. And there was a communist party within the United States because of the Great Depression. The party was growing in various sectors of the United States. And they believed that was the way to solve some of the problems of the economic issues within the United States. And so to root out communists within the United States, that guy that you can see at the top there, his name was McCarthy. He committed to what they call the Red Scare, trying to find communists within the country, which is an interesting topic in and of itself. Anyway, this is where rock and roll starts to get the crosshairs put onto it. Is this a communist threat sent by the Soviet to disrupt the teenager and create teenage rebellion? So, did the United States and the Soviet Union ever go toe to toe in a war? No, they did not, and thank goodness, because that could have led to a nuclear war. There was maybe some minor skirmishes at best, but they did try to always globally create entities to posture themselves to outdo the other side. One was in Germany. You'll see that in the Johnny Cash movie. Johnny Cash was sent to Germany and Berlin, even to protect Berlin and to keep it from falling completely to the communist side. They eventually create the Berlin Wall, which we'll talk more about later. But anyway, that whole city was split. The east side was communist, the west side was supposed to be democratic. And that leads to this thing called the Berlin Airlift, when we shipped in supplies to Berlin to keep it from starving and falling to the Soviet Union. And finally, there was an actual war that we sent troops. It was called the Korean War. It was a shorter war. And some of the early rock and rollers, I believe Chuck Berry actually served in the Korean War. Anyway, the Korean War was fought when it was split north and south, and the northern forces were communists, and they invaded the south, pushing our forces, the democratic forces, the not communist forces, down to the city of Busan. And then when we sent in a general by the name of MacArthur, and he actually had success in driving the communists into China. But then the Chinese got offended by this, and they sent in troops. And the war starts where it ends, or ends where it starts, at the 38th parallel in the demilitarized zone. So that's the Korean War in short. So, what is the big upshot here when it's all said and done? One of the big fears of rock and roll was that it was, again, commie music, that it was going to warp the minds and create teenage rebellion that was sent from the Soviet Union. But as told about in this book called Rock Around the Block, little did we know that the Soviets were fearing the exact same thing, and that they thought it might be an American plot to take over the mind of the Soviet youth. So, all those strikes against rock and roll, that it was race music, that it was teenage rebellion music, that it was commie music, all these things, put them in a blender, frappe, these are the strikes against rock and roll, but from there it will bloom into the music that you and I love so dearly. So that is it. Have a good day. Get those notes done. This is G signing off.